October 1396. In Westminster, the crown slips from the head of a 6-year-old girl, and people are crushed in the crowd. The seal of peace is not placed on parchment. It is placed on her childhood. Tell me honestly, how long does peace bought at such a price last? Next to the 29-year-old King Richard II of England walks a child who barely touches the floor with her toes. A gloved hand leads her forward, and the crown made to measure seems heavier than her neck. This is Isabella de Valois, daughter of the French king. Chronicles wrote that thousands wanted to see the child queen. This day is remembered not as a romantic fairy tale, but as a demonstration of how states make peace, with a seal on a child's body. The dowry was 800,000 francs, an amount capable of financing a war for years. England got a pause, France got a breather, and in the abbey itself, symbols spoke louder than words. English roses alongside French lilies, a ceremony of the English court interwoven with French accents. The child's eyes caught the stained glass and silver. They were more understandable than political agreements. Those present saw a restrained Richard and a tense but relieved court. It was as if peace had become a reality. But no one could drown out the ethical sting that hung under the vaults. The union had been bought at the price of a particular girl's childhood. When the crown was placed on her head and the abbey erupted in applause, the question was just beginning. Would the peace last longer than her neck could bear the crown? And would this child ever become an independent figure, or would she forever remain a trophy on a foreign throne? The pages of diplomatic treaties smelled of wax and metal. Seals pressed harder than words. 1396. Negotiations between England and France lasted for months, and every letter could cost tens of thousands of lives. In the halls of the Louvre, they discussed not only numbers and terms, but also the body of a specific child. Isabella de Valois became the main argument for peace. A clause was included in the text of the agreement that would make even a cold-hearted lawyer shudder. The marriage would not be consummated until the bride reached maturity. In black and white, officially among financial and military obligations, the dowry was 800,000 gold francs. This would be enough to arm an army and maintain a fleet for years. For the treasury, this was not an abstraction. This amount actually changed the pace of the war. It could delay the campaign or allow the king to hold the front longer than the enemies had expected. The agreement promised 27 years of truce. A whole generation could grow up without the drums of war. But just as diplomats were writing down 27 years of peace, the French army suffered a catastrophe at Nicopolis. Thousands of knights, including the cream of the French nobility, died in an unsuccessful crusade against the Ottomans. The paradox sounded cruel. On one front, France was buying peace through a child marriage, while on the other, it was losing a generation in the meat grinder of war. France gained a respite, England a chance to stabilize the throne of Richard II and fill the treasury. Everyone understood. This was not a love story. It was diplomacy, where the fate of a child became a guarantee of peace. When the documents were signed and the seals affixed, the chronicles recorded an alliance sealed not with the blood of warriors, but with a child's body. And in that silence, one question remained unspoken. If a child can become currency, what then remains sacred? Isabella's childhood was not idyllic, but spent in a palace that could easily turn into a labyrinth of fear. Her father, French King Charles VI, known as the Mad, lived between the clarity of a ruler and the darkness of illness. All the maids remembered his attacks. Sometimes the king would stand motionless for hours because he believed he was made of glass and the slightest touch would shatter his body into pieces. This condition was called glass mania, a painful delusion that spread throughout late medieval Europe. Charles forbade even his children from touching him. Doctors advised padding his clothes with cotton wool so that he would not break. Absurd, but a very real practice of the time. On other days, he could refuse to wash for months, see conspiracies in his own courtyard, and forget the names of his closest relatives. Then the children were taken to other rooms so that they would not hear their father's screams. Just a few years earlier, in 1393, Paris had witnessed another terrible spectacle. During the masquerade Ball of the Burning People, King Charles and several courtiers dressed in costumes made of tarred cloth when a torch accidentally touched the fabric. 4 of them burned alive right before the eyes of the Queen and the court. Charles himself was saved only by a miracle. This scene remained etched in Isabella's memory for years. Her father, who thought he was made of glass, dancing among the flames. After that tragedy, Paris began to severely restrict the use of torches in enclosed spaces. But the fear of fire lived on for a long time, haunting both the king and the court. For Isabella, it was a double lesson. Gold and marble alongside silence and horror. She learned to freeze when the air in the rooms thickened with anxiety, and she understood that power could be as fragile as the glass her father believed in. Where other children played, Isabella learned the most important thing: to survive alongside instability. And every new day reminded her that even the royal throne was not built on steel, but on a fragile illusion that could crumble at any moment. October 31st, 1396. The city of Calais, English territory on French soil. A ceremony took place here that was supposed to be a symbol of peace, but looked more like a diplomatic spectacle. The girl is only 7 years old. She walks in a heavy gold-woven dress, weighed down with pearls so much that she cannot walk without servants. Her new husband, 29-year-old Richard II, kneels to at least somewhat match her height. From the outside, it looked like a gesture of protection, but everyone understood that it was a strange balance: an adult monarch and a child bride. Doesn't this balance seem strange to you? An adult king kneeling before a 7-year-old girl, and this is presented as a union between 2 states? Diplomats took care of even the smallest symbols. Miniature portraits traveled by sea long before the meeting as a sign of betrothal. Now these images came to life, and no witness could look away. A few months later, on January 8, 1397, Isabella was crowned at Westminster Abbey. Thousands of people gathered in London, and the city came out to see the little queen. For the capital, she became a public trophy, a living symbol of the agreement with France. The barons counted coins, the ambassadors counted years. And the question remained open: what would be more expensive for England? The promised 27 years of peace, or the burden of an alliance concluded on foreign soil and placed on a child's head? Children's voices rang out in Westminster, as in any court in Europe. The royal apartments were filled with the children of nobles, who were sent to be educated alongside the monarch. Among them was Isabella, a French princess who had to learn the rules of a foreign stage. Chronicles mention her friend Margaret Holland, only slightly older, but already more mature. Together, they practiced bowing and smiling, because even children's gestures were part of political discipline here. The most difficult test was language. French words were punished, forcing them to speak English even when their tongues were still tangled. It was not just learning, but a slow rewriting of identity. But when the political storms swept away Richard II, the children's voices fell silent. In 1399, Isabella was no longer carried in triumphal processions. She was transported under guard, not to a ceremonial court, but in a locked carriage under the gaze of soldiers with torches. At first, she was settled in the bishop's palace in Sonning, and later in Havering at Bower. The apartments were decent, but under close supervision. The windows overlooked the gardens, and there were guards at the door. It was not a home, nor was it quite a dungeon. Rather, it was a golden cage that served as a reminder. You are not the mistress, you are a hostage. English chroniclers wrote that King Richard II abdicated voluntarily. In the letters, it looked like humility before the will of the people. But between the lines, another story could be read: pressure, coercion, hopelessness. For Isabella, this moment was the collapse of her entire familiar world. At the age of 9, she became the widow of a living man. For Richard was not only deprived of his throne, he was symbolically erased. His supporters turned away, his titles disappeared, and his path into the depths of the walls ended in death at Pontefract Castle. Rumors spread. Some said he was starved to death, others that he was killed on the orders of Henry IV. But the truth no longer mattered. For Isabella, only one fact remained: the man who was more of a guardian than a husband to her was gone forever. She remained in her chambers without protection. Her world shrank to a few rooms and signatures on other people's letters. History showed its cynicism. The Union, created for the sake of 27 years of peace, fell apart faster than a child's memory lasted. In the chronicles, Isabella began to be called the widow at 9. It sounded absurd, but that is how she entered the English annals. Imagine, you are 9 years old, and chroniclers are already calling you a widow. How would you yourself survive such an absurd stamp on your life? After Henry IV's ascension, Isabella's situation changed. She was no longer the king's wife, just a diplomatic trophy. Her presence in London became both a burden and an asset. Henry demanded that she formally recognize him as monarch and renounce her title of queen. For a 9-year-old girl, this sounded abstract, but for politics, it was worth its weight in gold. Her oath would determine whether France would recognize the new ruler or whether the drums of war would sound again. Everything was used in the negotiations, even oaths on relics, to extract consent. For Isabella herself, this meant one thing. She ceased to be a person and became a currency traded between two kingdoms. And here, a question hung in the air that still sounds acute today. If even a child queen could become a bargaining chip, who in medieval politics could feel safe? When Isabella was returned to France, she was welcomed as the king's daughter, but not quite as his own. She grew up at the English court and brought with her habits that betrayed her foreignness. Chronicles noted that her French had an English accent. Her clothes were tailored in the English fashion, and even her manners were more reminiscent of London than Paris. What was supposed to make her a bridge between cultures now aroused suspicion. Was she a spy? Was she too English for the daughter of France? At court meetings, people even whispered, "What if she's too English?" And it wasn't just about language, but about trusting her every move. Imagine, you return home after years of exile, and your native language sounds foreign to your ears. How can you prove that you are one of them when your every gesture reminds them of another court? Her relatives surrounded her. Her advisors whispered. But the mistrust did not disappear. For Isabella, the paradox was obvious. The princess from the Louvre, the Queen of England, now had to prove in Paris that she was not a stranger. At the beginning of the 15th century, Isabella was no longer seen in France as just a child hostage of peace. Now she was the widow of the English king, the daughter of the House of Valois, and a symbol of experience that could be used in politics. The crown's advisors weighed who to give her hand to. The choice fell on Charles of Orleans, young, cultured, and ambitious. This union was no longer presented as a contract with a child, but as an equal marriage between two branches of royal blood. The wedding was a high-profile event. Paris was decorated with the coats of arms of Valois and Orleans, and poetry and music filled the halls. Charles was famous for his love of books and poetry. Artists and scholars gathered at his court. Think about it. The girl who was paraded around London as a trophy of peace was now becoming a partner in the cultural center of France. From hostage to participant in intellectual life. For Isabella, this was a turning point. She was no longer just being paraded around in processions. People were starting to listen to her. And now the question was different. Could she turn her experience as a hostage into her own strength? In her new marriage to Charles of Orleans, Isabella had a chance at something resembling a normal life. Books, poets, salons, children. But even in this world, her body remained a battlefield, now not of diplomacy, but of nature. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a test of survival. Fever and complications mowed down women regardless of their titles. Doctors advised bloodletting, applied poultices, prayed, but more often than not, they exhausted rather than saved. Honestly, would you do it again, knowing the survival statistics? Each new pregnancy could be a death sentence, but women were still expected to produce heirs. Isabella knew this fear. She made vows of restraint, weighed the risks, and tried to maintain a balance between motherhood and survival. But for the court, her body was still a tool, now for the continuation of the dynasty. So she found herself trapped again. Even her royal body never belonged to her completely. September 13, 1409. Isabella Valois, former child queen of England and now wife of Charles of Orleans, died at the age of 20. Her body was weakened by childbirth and illness, and her soul left the world in prayer. The funeral was a spectacle worthy of the daughter of the King of France. Her body was embalmed, and her heart was carried separately, an ancient tradition symbolizing the division between duty and love. Imagine the procession, the coffin, the banners, and suddenly, a small box with her heart. A heart that lived not only for the dynasty, but also for itself. Is this not the most eloquent symbol of her life? Envoys from all over Europe walked the streets of Paris. For chroniclers, it was an opportunity to sum up. Isabella survived her father's madness, became a hostage to peace between two warring states, endured life in a golden cage, and died, leaving behind the image of a little girl with a crown who bore the weight of history. Her life was short, but her legacy was long. She reminded us that alliances can be sealed with gold, seals, and blood, but the strongest ones are always sealed with human destiny. The story of Isabella de Valois is not a romantic legend about kings and queens. It is the story of a child who was made an instrument of politics, and at the same time, a person who managed to preserve her dignity where others saw only currency. Her marriage to Richard II was a contract, not a fairy tale. Her childhood in France was a school of survival alongside the Glass King. Her years in England were not the upbringing of a future queen, but the life of a hostage in a golden cage. Even her second marriage, albeit an equal one, did not free her from the fact that the female body in medieval politics always remained a battlefield. Think about it. She lived only 20 years. But she left Europe with the image of a little girl with a crown, who carried the burden of peace between two warring states. Her story raises questions for us too. How is power measured? By gold and armies? Or perhaps by the ability of a single child to bear the weight of a crown heavier than her own head? And have we really become better, if even today children often remain hostages to the decisions of others? By the way, we have a separate historical story about Charles VI, the Glass King, with all its dramatic episodes. If you are interested in more details, watch it after this video.